Since 1994, Val Burgess has recorded nearly 200 oral histories of World War II prisoners of war. It was and is her commitment that these veteran stories are kept alive and heard across the globe and by audiences of all ages. This work began when her uncle Vernon Burda spoke of wanting to return to his POW camp, prisoner of war, Stalag Luft 3, the great escape camp of World War II fame, in honor of the 50th anniversary of their liberation from another camp, Stalag 7A. In order to take a large group, Berta needed someone to market the trip. Val volunteered selfishly, wanting only the free trip to Europe. That journey experience changed her life. For the last 28 years, she has recorded their oral histories because we must hear what our soldiers endured. Today, her Wars Voices archive holds a vast collection of stories and research of a vast number of prisoners from both theaters of war. This evening, we get to hear one of those stories. Please join me in welcoming Val Burgess as she shares, "Failure was not an option." Val?
Have you ever felt like there was something so important and you knew failure was not an option? Perhaps when you were in the military, or an illness, or something in your life that seemed so incredibly important that you knew you had to win. You couldn't allow failure to stop you. We must know the stories of war. We need to share those stories with people of all ages because it matters. You matter, they matter. And what you can learn from them, those stories, is simply incredible. My life has changed because I knew these men, and I will forever be grateful. Tonight, I'm going to introduce you to William Billy Lamar Grafton. He was about this tall, but he was a mighty soul. He fully understood in his life, well, maybe he didn't use those terms, but he knew that failure was not an option for him. He was born on November 11th, 1924. He had 4 other older brothers, and along came another sibling after him. But one of his brothers wanted his mother to name Bill Armistice. You know, the brothers were really going for it, but Mama, she didn't take the bait. She called him Billy instead. Prior to the Great Depression, Surrey Grafton decided to buy a 16-acre farm. After all, his boys were really city boys. And he thought living on a farm would really make a difference in their life. Plus, he really wasn't sure about what the economy was going to do. They moved to Enterprise, Mississippi. The boys took charge of the farm, but their father's tutelage was also a part of their success. They had a huge garden, orchards, they had nut trees, pecan trees. And everyone they knew, they ate, their friends ate. Anyone who needed food came by and they were fed. Even those who rode the rails knew that it was what they would consider sort of an easy mark, but in fact, they were just good people that wanted others to eat. They raised ducks, chickens, turkeys, pigs, and beef cattle. So they had milk, they had eggs, they had meat. You know, they were dirt poor, but in actuality, they had food to eat, which meant they were really rich in many, many ways. Bill's father died shortly after the 8 years that they lived on the farm. They had to move away because he couldn't raise the final $500 to pay off the farm. And so it was given back to the former owner. Bill, his mom, his younger brother, they moved into a boarding house in another town to be near his older brother. There he went to school. But not only did he go to school, he got up in the morning before school and he worked at the Calhoun store. He worked at lunchtime and he worked in the evenings till 10 o'clock. He did it Monday through Friday and also on Sunday, the full day, and earned $12 a week. It helped his mom and his brother. It helped sustain them at the boarding house. Bill was in the 10th grade. He was a straight A student. Pearl Harbor hadn't occurred. His 4 older brothers decided to join the military. The oldest went into the Navy, the other 3, the Army Air Corps. And Bill continued going to school. On December 7th, 1941, well, all of you, I'm sure, know what happened. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. We were at war with not only Germany, but Japan. And the government needed to fill those people to fight the war effort. Bill knew he would be drafted because the draft was on. And he also knew that when he turned 18, they'd draft him, they'd select the service that they wanted him to participate in. And he would probably end up on the front lines. That was not to be. A week before his 18th birthday, Bill Grafton went and signed up, quit school, and joined the Army Air Corps. You know, because he didn't have a diploma, he was unable to apply for or take the test to be a pilot. For him, he became a sergeant, an engineer, and a top turret gunner on a B-24. That plane really bothered him because, you know, he knew that if the wing was hit, those gas tanks in that wing would catch fire. But the B-24 also always smelled of gasoline. There was that smell. So not only would the wing catch fire, but the entire plane would go up because of those fumes. They called it the flying coffin. Bill and his crew, the Applegate crew, and 47 other crews were stationed to go to the Philippines and fight the Imperial Japanese forces. They were going by transport, and they were down around Algeria when they let them off the ship. All of them, the 48 crews and all of their support staff. Their orders had been lost. They didn't know what they were going to do, so they left them there. No one even knew where they were for months. They were bored, they were tired, they just wanted to move on somewhere and be in the war effort. However, because they were sergeants and officers, none of them could help. They couldn't work in the kitchen, they couldn't do KP duty, they couldn't do a lot of things. Until one day, the 15th Air Force found out about them. They were stationed in Italy, and they had had major losses of aircraft and men. When they decided to go for it, they went to the top brass, you know, those commanding generals, and they said, you know, we know these men, although they fly B-24s, they'll do fine. They can catch on and they'll be able to fly B-17s quite well. They believed it and brought them over to Europe. They gave them manuals the first day there and gave them 2 days to study so that they could be in combat within a week. Lucky for Bill, he was smart, he was easy, education was easy for him. And he found he loved the B-17. He felt it was much, much safer. Bill and his crew, the Applegate crew, started flying. At that time in Europe, the crews were determined to complete 50 missions. Unfortunately for Bill and his crew, they were on their 18th mission over Geier. Anyway, they were going to bomb an airdrome, an airfield. They were in Hungary. And as they're flying over the airfield, they complete the mission, and the Messerschmitt 109s came after them. They lobbed rockets. One went right through their wing. They had a fire they couldn't put out. It was lucky that they could even stabilize the aircraft. The pilot got a hold of his men over the air intercom and said, "It's time to bail out." 7 of them went out. They could see the parachutes moving to the ground. Left was the pilot, Applegate, Finn, the co-pilot, and Bill on the flight deck. Flynn and Applegate were fighting over who was going to be the last to leave the aircraft. Bill was clipping on his parachute, as was Applegate and Finn. Bill went out the bomb bay. Applegate went out the window near the pilot's seat. They don't know what happened to Finn. As they were going down, Bill and Applegate could see each other. They tried to look back to see where he was, but they didn't see anything. And then all of a sudden there was this big explosion, a fireball, and that was it. When they got to the ground, they were free for 4 days. So they got a little comfortable and they went to Lake Balaton to get some water in broad daylight and were captured by the Home Guard. The Hungarians were treating them very poorly because they didn't know who they were. They didn't know what branch of service or what country they were from. They brought the Germans in who took the men, and they then learned they were Americans. They fed them food and wine and hugged them and thanked them. And probably if they had figured out, or they could have communicated, they may have never been captured. They may have helped them get home. They stayed in a prison for a couple of weeks. They were interrogated, the old stuff. And finally, there were a lot of pilots and 100 sergeants that were put on trains to go west to Sagen, Germany. It's now Sagen, Poland, to a prison camp called Stalag Luft 3. It was the prison camp, the Ritz of prison camps, and it truly was the location of the Great Escape. There were 10,000 men in prison camp. They were in 5 compounds, Commonwealth officers and American officers. It was toward the end of the war in 44, after July. And the German guards said to these 100 sergeants, we can take you 7 to 8 days to your prison camp north by the Baltic. What do you want to do? And they opted to stay at Stalag Luft 3. They became orderlies, cooks, all kinds of things, but it was fairly safe for them. And then in January of 1945, January 27th to be exact, Hitler didn't want those Americans or the Allied, any of the Allied air crews to go back into the war effort because the Russian onslaught, they could feel the percussion of the infantry. They knew it was close, and they forced marched those men on January 27th at 11 o'clock at night. 2,000 men marched out. The next morning, another 2,000, until 10,000 men were on the road west. It was the coldest winter on record. It was painful for them. They had poor clothing, bad shoes. They had food they were carrying with them. They carried everything with them and they were dropping it along the road. Some just laid down and died. For days they walked. Sometimes they got to sleep in barns where they got fleas and lice. And then one day they got to sleep inside of a brick factory where they turned the kilns up and almost burnt the place down, but they were warm. They were finally taken to a town called Spremberg where they received from the Germans barley soup. It was hot. It was nutritious. It was like food of the gods. And many of them were so grateful for it because they felt so good about it. The Germans very quickly started moving these POWs all kinds of places. They spent huge train loads down south to Moosburg, which was outside northeast of Munich. And then they sent another group to a prison camp called Stalag 13D. It was outside of Nuremberg, and they were bombed night by the British, all day long by the Americans. They were by the rally grounds, and so that was always a target. They could hear the bombs coming down and would count 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. And when that bomb landed, they could tell approximately how close it was. It was a hellhole. It was a mess. They really needed to get out of there. And thank God, in April of 1945, they were forced marched south so that they could be in Moosburg and at Stalag 7A. It was a good trip for them. It was 92 miles they walked. They were strafed sometimes by Allied fighters, but they just jumped in the, in the ditches, and they were lucky. And then soon, those same fighters knew they were POWs, so they just wiggled their wings, and it felt like they were almost going home. They bartered with the Germans with their D-bars, their chocolate bars, their leftover cigarettes, and their soap. It was a good deal for them. And just being outside of barbed wire felt amazing. Bill Grafton was one of those, obviously. He was, when Patton came in, his Third Army liberated these men. And when he came in, Bill was standing behind him as he stood up in his Jeep. And there's his little face right over here behind him. They took these men by C-47s to Lucky Strike, Camp Lucky Strike, where they were stripped of their clothing to put it in the fire because they hadn't bathed since January. They then fed them, they deloused them, and they put thousands upon thousands of POWs and injured soldiers on transport ships to take them home to the United States. The war was over with. It was actually the largest ferrying of troops across the ocean. Bill went home. They put all those people, they put the men from the South together and the men from the North together and put them on troop ships. So when they got to the United States, the train would move them and them and them. And it was very, very efficient. Bill was told to go on R&R in Florida, at which time he finished his GED. He then got a hold of the University of Alabama because he wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. Passed everything, worked hard, and his first job was actually for the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, NACA. There he was testing the speed of airplanes. They were using a wind tunnel. He was working and modifying airplanes. He worked on an X-1 and rebuilt it, and his modifications made it better. He worked on the X-2, the X-4, the X-5, and then he was getting bored. And so he wrote a letter to Huntsville, the 123 rocket scientists who were not captured, but they were down by Munich, and they were looking for Americans because they didn't want the Russians to capture them. It was Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, Magnus von Braun, a lot of them, and they were building V1 and V2 rockets in Germany, and they brought them to the United States. Bill wrote them a letter. He was interviewed and hired on the spot, and he worked with Werner von Braun on the first missile. the Redstone missile. From there, he and Werner went to NASA. As a matter of fact, he was there the day on January 29th, 1969, when Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. I don't know if you remember, but I always remember those big backpacks they had on their back. Remember those big white ones? They were their oxygenator. It was just crazy that those things were so big, but they needed them. As it was, one of the astronauts turned quickly and hit the toggle or hit the switch that turned on the Eagle lander and broke it off. NASA had a problem. The astronauts had a problem because how were they going to get them home? They took stock of the astronauts before they left for their moonwalk. And when they came back, they thought they had a solution. They had to see what the astronauts, of course, had in their pockets. And someone said to me, well, one of those guys must have been a Boy Scout because he was prepared. He had a ballpoint pen with him. And that ballpoint pen was made of metal because at that time, there were no plastic Bic pens. I think I remember those as being the first. So they took that ballpoint pen, they opened it up, they took out the inside, put it back together, pushed very hard on that starter. And I guess you could say the rest is history. But what really amazes me, it was a little ballpoint pen that saved two men's life and possibly saved what would have happened had those men died? What would be different about our world? What would it have been like? Would the Russians have continued? Would our space exploration died? Would we be in a completely different world right now? Possibly, I don't know. I try and think about it, and I hope maybe you guys will think about it a little bit because it's really such an incredible situation that they found themselves in. That day, failure was not an option for any of them, for Wernher von Braun, for Bill Grafton, for any of the other engineers. They had to solve that. I looked up who came up with that saying, failure is not an option. And unfortunately, it was with Apollo 13. But then I thought, well, I can finish this presentation with a little story about Apollo 13 because Bill Grafton just happened to be there for that one too. He said when those astronauts were out of oxygen, remember Tom Hanks was in it and they were trying to get him oxygen and they were going to suffocate and they didn't know what they would do. Bill Grafton and those men figured out how to make the air pure so that those men would survive. He told me when I watch that movie, I sweat. I can't stand to watch it. It just brings it all back to me. And I'm so stressed out. I really, honestly can't watch it. There's another instance where failure was not an option. I would like to say to all of you, I don't really use that exact saying, but I like the idea of failure's not an option. It means I get up earlier in the morning. I start my day working quickly and efficiently. Everything I want to do with my speaking career, with the work I've done and put my heart into for the last 28 years, I want to share with the world. It's that important to me. Heck, I spent a big chunk of my retirement because it was that important to me. I asked for you that you too, whatever it is that you want to do, whatever it is that makes you alive, that brings you joy, or that just makes you work harder because it's good. I hope that you find failure is not an option for you as well. Master Toastmaster?